Imagine being ordered to go to war against nothing. No enemy, no army, no target, just endless white ice, stretching further than the eye can see, in the coldest, most lifeless place on Earth. That is exactly what 4,700 men were told to do. The United States Navy sent them south, with 13 warships, an aircraft carrier, a combat submarine, and 33 aircraft, into a continent where no one lives and no one fights. It was the largest force ever sent to Antarctica, a military operation on a scale that made no sense. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The fleet was pulled out. The mission was shut down months ahead of schedule. The men came home. What were they searching for in that frozen silence? Why send a war fleet to a place with no war? And what made them leave in such a hurry? This is Operation Highjump. To understand why America sent a war fleet into the ice, we first have to understand the man who led them there. His name was Richard Byrd. He was born in 1888 in the green and peaceful Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He came from an old, respected family, a family of lawyers, politicians, and gentlemen. By every expectation of his time, young Richard Byrd should have lived a quiet, comfortable life far away from danger. But Byrd was not built for comfort. Even as a small boy, he was restless. He craved adventure. He wanted to see the parts of the world that no one else had seen. At just 12 years old, Byrd traveled alone, all the way around the globe, a journey that would terrify most grown men. That same hunger for the unknown never left him. It only grew stronger. As a young man, Byrd joined the United States Navy, but a bad ankle injury threatened to end his career before it truly began. The Navy nearly pushed him out. For most men, that would have been the end of the story. For Richard Byrd, it was only the beginning. Byrd found his true calling in the air. He became a naval aviator at a time when flying was still new, dangerous, and deadly. Aircraft were fragile machines of wood, wire, and fabric. Pilots died often, but Byrd was fascinated by flight, and especially by the idea of using aircraft to explore the last unmapped corners of the Earth. And in the 1920s, the greatest unmapped place of all was the frozen poles. In 1926, Richard Byrd made the claim that would make him world famous. He announced that he and his pilot had flown an aircraft all the way over the North Pole and back. It was a sensation. Byrd was celebrated as a national hero. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States. Crowds cheered his name. Newspapers printed his face. Now, history has questioned that flight. Even today, experts debate whether Byrd's plane truly reached the North Pole that day, or whether it fell short. The truth may never be fully known. But one thing was certain. Richard Byrd had become the most famous explorer in America, and he was about to turn his eyes toward an even greater prize: the bottom of the world, Antarctica. Antarctica, in the 1920s, was the most mysterious place on the planet. It was a continent larger than Europe, buried under ice miles thick. Almost none of it had been mapped. Almost none of it had been seen by human eyes. It was a blank white space on the map of the world. Richard Byrd decided he would be the one to fill in that space. In 1928, he launched his first Antarctic expedition. He sailed south and built a base camp on the floating ice of the Ross Ice Shelf. He called it Little America. From this frozen outpost, in 1929, Byrd attempted another history-making flight, this time over the South Pole. The aircraft strained against the thin, freezing air. To gain enough height to clear the mountains, the crew was forced to throw their emergency supplies out of the plane. But they made it. Byrd had now flown over both ends of the Earth. He returned to America a legend once again. But Byrd was not finished. He came back to Antarctica for a second expedition in the early 1930s. And it was during this second journey that Richard Byrd would face the most terrifying ordeal of his entire life. During his second expedition, Byrd made a fateful decision. He chose to man a remote weather station, completely alone, through the brutal Antarctic winter. The station was a tiny shack, buried in the ice, more than 100 miles from his base camp at Little America. For months, Byrd lived by himself in total isolation. Outside, the temperature dropped low enough to kill a man in minutes. The sun vanished completely, leaving him in endless, crushing darkness. He was utterly alone, in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. And then, the station tried to kill him. The small stove and generator that kept Byrd alive were also slowly poisoning him. They leaked carbon monoxide, an invisible, odorless, deadly gas, into his tiny shelter. Day by day, Byrd grew weaker. He suffered crippling headaches. His body failed him. His mind began to slip. He was dying, alone, in the dark, with no one to help him. When his men back at base realized something was terribly wrong, they launched a desperate rescue mission across the deadly ice. After agonizing delays, they finally reached him and saved his life just in time. But Richard Byrd was never quite the same again. The man who emerged from that ice was older, frilier, and more haunted. Some who knew him said he never truly recovered from those months alone in the dark. That experience left a permanent mark on him, body and soul. And yet, even that brush with death could not keep him away from the ice forever. By 1946, the world had changed completely. The Second World War was over. The most destructive conflict in human history had finally ended. More than 70 million people were dead. Cities across the globe lay in ruins. Humanity, exhausted and grieving, longed for peace. But peace did not come. Instead, a new and colder kind of war began to take shape, a war between the two great powers left standing, the United States and the Soviet Union. This was the beginning of the Cold War, a struggle not of bullets and battlefields, but of fear, suspicion, and the constant dread of what the other side might be planning. And there was a new weapon now that made that fear far worse than ever before: the atomic bomb. For the first time in history, mankind possessed a weapon that could erase entire cities in a single flash of light. Both sides knew it, and both sides began to imagine the unthinkable, a surprise attack that could come at any moment, from any direction. The question that haunted American military planners was simple and chilling. If the Soviet Union ever attacked, where would the attack come from? The answer that frightened them most was the poles. If you look at a globe, the shortest path between the United States and the Soviet Union does not cross the wide oceans. It crosses the top of the world, over the frozen Arctic. American military leaders suddenly realized a terrifying truth. Soviet bombers, and one day Soviet missiles, could fly straight over the North Pole and strike the American heartland. The vast oceans that had always protected America were no longer a shield. The frozen poles had become the new front line. The United States military scrambled to respond. They created the Strategic Air Command to guard against attack from the north. They began studying how to fight, fly, and survive in extreme polar conditions. And that is where Antarctica entered the picture. The Navy realized it knew almost nothing about operating in a frozen world. How would ships behave in pack ice? Could aircraft fly in such brutal cold? Could men even survive long enough to fight? America needed answers, and it needed them fast. Antarctica, the most extreme cold weather environment on Earth, would become a giant testing ground. A frozen laboratory where America could prepare for a war in the ice. There was one more reason, a reason that was kept quiet at the time. It was not only about training. It was about land. After the war, Antarctica had become a quiet point of tension between nations. Several countries were beginning to eye the frozen continent, wondering who would one day claim its territory and whatever resources might lie beneath its ice. The United States did not want to be left behind, and so the Navy was given secret orders, orders that were classified at the time, to do everything it could to lay the groundwork for an American claim to Antarctic land, training for a polar war, securing a foothold on a new continent, and proving to a budget-cutting president that the Navy was still powerful and still necessary in this new post-war world. These were the real forces driving what was about to happen, and standing at the center of it all was an old, tired, but still legendary explorer, Richard Byrd. By now, Byrd was no longer the young hero who had flown over the poles. He was aging and not in good health. The Navy would truly run the operation. But they still needed Byrd. They needed his famous name, his reputation, and his unmatched experience with the ice. It would be Byrd's fourth expedition to Antarctica, and it would be the largest, most ambitious journey to that frozen continent that the world had ever seen. The pieces were now in place. The fear was real. The orders were given. It was time to build an armada. In the summer of 1946, the orders came down. The United States Navy was going to Antarctica, and it was not going quietly. The operation was given a name, Operation Highjump. And to carry it out, the Navy assembled a special military formation, a fleet built for a single purpose. They called it Task Force 68. This was not a small scientific expedition. This was not a handful of explorers with sled dogs and tents. Task Force 68 was a war fleet, assembled with the full might of the most powerful navy on Earth. The numbers alone tell the story. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and 4,700 men. It would become the largest expedition ever sent to the Antarctic continent. Nothing on this scale had ever been attempted at the bottom of the world, and arguably, nothing like it ever would be again. The orders were issued on the 26th of August, 1946. The clock was now ticking. The Navy had only a few short months to assemble this armada and send it south before the Antarctic summer. The only window when ships could even reach the continent slammed shut. The race was on. At the heart of any fleet are its ships. And the ships of Task Force 68 were a carefully chosen mixture of muscle, endurance, and firepower. At the center of the fleet sailed the flagship, the USS Mount Olympus. This was the command ship, the floating headquarters from which the entire operation would be directed. Its radio rooms would be the nerve center of Highjump, connecting every ship across hundreds of miles of frozen ocean. Then there was the most powerful vessel of them all, the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea. An aircraft carrier in Antarctic waters was something the world had never seen. This floating airfield would carry Admiral Byrd's largest aircraft to the very edge of the ice. But warships of steel faced a deadly enemy in the polar seas, the ice itself. Thick pack ice can crush a normal hull like paper. So the fleet needed special ships to lead the way. These were the icebreakers, vessels with reinforced hulls and immense power, designed to ram and smash through frozen seas. Ships like the USS Burton Island and the Coast Guard's Northwind would carve a path through the ice for the rest of the fleet to follow. The fleet also included supply ships, loaded with everything thousands of men would need to survive: fuel, food, building materials, and equipment. There were seaplane tenders to service the aircraft. And there were tankers carrying the lifeblood of the entire operation: fuel. 13 ships in total, each one with a role to play, each one essential. But there was one ship in Task Force 68 that did not belong with the others. One vessel whose presence raised eyebrows then, and still raises questions today. A submarine. Her name was the USS Senate, and she was a combat submarine, a weapon of war, designed to hunt and sink enemy ships beneath the waves. What was a combat submarine doing on a scientific expedition to a continent with no enemy and no navy to fight? The official answer was straightforward. The Navy wanted to know whether submarines could operate in Antarctic conditions at all. Could a submarine survive among the ice floes? Could it function in those freezing waters? It was, they said, simply another test. And the test did not go well. The Senate found the brutal pack ice far too dangerous for a submarine to handle. The ice threatened to trap and crush her. In the end, she had to be towed back out of the danger zone by an icebreaker, and she spent the rest of the operation in safer waters. But the very presence of a combat submarine revealed something important about Operation Highjump. This was not really a peaceful voyage of discovery. This was the military testing its weapons of war in a new and hostile theater. If the ships were the body of Task Force 68, then the aircraft were its eyes. The whole purpose of Operation Highjump depended on what could be seen from the air. The Navy wanted to photograph and map as much of Antarctica as humanly possible, and to do that, they brought 33 aircraft to the bottom of the world. The stars of this air fleet were the R-4D aircraft, the rugged military version of the famous DC-3. These were large, powerful planes, and getting them into Antarctica required a daring trick. They were too big for a normal takeoff from the carrier deck. So the crews fitted them with special rockets, JATO bottles, strapped beneath their wings. With a burst of rocket power, the heavy planes could leap off the deck of the USS Philippine Sea and roar toward the ice. There were also the PBM flying boats, seaplanes that could land directly on water, launched from the seaplane tenders. And then there was something brand new, something that had never been used in Antarctica before: helicopters. In 1946, the helicopter was still a strange and experimental machine. But Task Force 68 brought them south, and they quickly proved their worth. Hovering above the icebreakers, helicopter crews could spot weak points and open channels in the pack ice, guiding the ships through the maze of frozen sea. It was the first time these machines had ever flown over the White Continent. A fleet this large could not simply sail south in a single line. So Task Force 68 was divided into 3 separate groups, each with its own task. First, there was the Central Group. This was the heart of the operation. Led by the flagship Mount Olympus, the Central Group carried the men and materials that would punch through the pack ice and establish the main base on the continent itself. Second, there was the Eastern Group. This group was sent to explore and photograph the eastern reaches of the Antarctic coastline, sweeping across vast stretches of unmapped territory. Third, there was the Western Group. This group would do the same in the west, covering the other half of the continent's enormous coast. Together, these 3 groups were meant to encircle Antarctica, to map it, photograph it, and study it from every direction at once. In a single summer, the Navy hoped to learn more about the White Continent than humanity had learned in all the centuries before. In early December of 1946, the ships began to sail. From ports around the world, the vessels of Task Force 68 pointed their bows south, toward the ice, toward the cold, toward the unknown. The Armada was finally on its way. But before we follow that fleet into the ice, we have to ask the question that sits at the very center of this story. Why? Why pour this much steel, this much money, and this many men into a frozen and empty land? The Navy gave the public a clear and reasonable answer. Operation Highjump, they said, was about training. It was about testing ships, aircraft, and men in extreme cold. It was about science, mapping the coastline and gathering data. All of that was true, but it was not the whole truth. Behind closed doors, there were other goals, quieter goals. One was land. The Navy had been given classified orders to do whatever it could to support a future American claim to Antarctic territory. With other nations beginning to look hungrily at the continent, the United States did not intend to be left out. Another goal was about power and politics back home. The war was over, and President Truman wanted to shrink the military budget. The Navy felt it had to prove that it was still vital, still capable, still worth every dollar. A massive, headline-grabbing operation like Highjump was a way to show the president and the world exactly what the Navy could still do. And underneath it all was the shadow of the Soviet Union. The Soviets watched the announcement of Highjump with deep suspicion. One of their own naval journals openly accused the Americans of trying to seize control of the polar regions and build military bases there. So this was the truth of Operation Highjump. It was training. It was science. But it was also a land grab, a political statement, and an opening move in the Cold War, all sailing south together in one enormous fleet. And now that fleet was about to meet the most hostile place on Earth. By late December of 1946, the ships of Task Force 68 had crossed thousands of miles of open ocean. And then, one by one, they reached a place where the world seemed to end. Ahead of them lay the pack ice, a vast, broken, frozen sea that surrounds the Antarctic continent like a great white wall. It stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction. Beyond it lay the continent itself. But to get there, the fleet would have to break through. This was the moment the entire operation had been built for, and it would prove to be one of the hardest battles of all. The Central Group, carrying the men and materials to build the main base, began its push into the ice on the final days of 1946. Leading the way was the Icebreaker, the powerful ship designed for exactly this purpose. The Icebreaker did not sail through the ice. It fought it. The ship would charge forward, riding up onto the frozen surface, using its tremendous weight to crack and crush the ice beneath its hull. Then it would back up and charge again, and again, and again. It was slow, brutal, exhausting work. Progress was measured not in miles per hour, but in yards per hour. The journey through the pack ice became a grueling test of patience and endurance. The Central Group had to batter its way through hundreds of miles of frozen sea, and the ice was always changing. A channel that opened up in the morning could slam shut by the afternoon. The fleet could become trapped, locked in place by the shifting ice, forced to wait until the frozen sea decided to release them. This is where the helicopters proved their true value. Rising up from the deck of the Icebreaker, helicopter crews could see what no one on the ships could see, the layout of the ice for miles ahead. From the air, they could spot the weak points, the cracks, the open leads of water snaking through the frozen maze. Then they would guide the ships toward those openings, steering the entire fleet through the ice like a needle through cloth. Without those eyes in the sky, the journey might have been impossible. Day after day, the Central Group ground its way forward. It took 18 long, punishing days to fight through the pack ice. 18 days of charging, cracking, backing up, and charging again. And then, finally, on the 15th of January, 1947, the ships broke through into open water. Ahead of them lay their destination, a great inlet in the ice shelf known as the Bay of Whales. They had reached Antarctica. The moment the ships anchored, the real work began. On the ice of the Bay of Whales, the men of Task Force 68 set out to build a base, a small outpost of humanity on the most hostile continent on Earth. They named it Little America 4, the fourth in the line of bases Byrd's expeditions had built on Antarctic ice. It was a race against time and weather. Thousands of tons of cargo had to be moved off the ships and hauled across the ice. Fuel, food, timber, equipment, vehicles. Tractors dragged enormous sledges loaded with supplies. Men worked in brutal cold, in biting wind, under a sun that never set. Slowly, Little America 4 took shape. Tents and structures rose from the ice. Most importantly, the men carved out runways, long, flat airstrips compacted directly into the snow and ice. These runways were the entire point of the base, because from here, Admiral Byrd's aircraft would take to the skies and begin the true mission of Operation Highjump. But this work came at a cost. The ice was a dangerous place, and the labor was punishing. The continent would not give up its secrets for free. With the base established, the aircraft of Task Force 68 finally went to work. And what they accomplished was staggering. The mission was to photograph Antarctica, to capture the unmapped continent on film from the air, on a scale never attempted before. The aircraft flew again and again, crisscrossing the frozen landscape. They soared over mountain ranges that no human eye had ever seen. They flew above endless ice sheets, over jagged coastlines, across vast white plains. And their cameras never stopped clicking. By the end of the operation, the aircraft of Operation Highjump had completed dozens of long photographic flights. Together, they captured around 70,000 aerial photographs of Antarctica. 70,000 images. Pictures covering well over 1 million square miles of territory. In a single Antarctic summer, Operation Highjump had photographed more of the continent than had been seen in all of human history before it. Admiral Byrd believed they now had the material to create a complete and detailed map of the entire continent. But there was a problem, one that would only become clear later. Many of those photographs, as remarkable as they were, lacked something crucial: ground control points. Reference markers on the surface that would allow mapmakers to know exactly what they were looking at. Without them, a large number of those 70,000 photographs would prove far less useful than the Navy had hoped. Among all the flights of Operation Highjump, a few stood out as truly historic. In the middle of February 1947, Admiral Byrd took to the air for one of the most symbolic moments of the entire expedition: a flight over the South Pole itself. For Byrd, this was deeply personal. Years earlier, in 1929, he had become one of the first men ever to fly over the South Pole. Now, nearly 2 decades later, he was returning to that same spot at the bottom of the world, older, frilier, but still drawn to the ice. The aircraft flew over the pole, and the crew carried out a small ceremony in the air, honoring the achievement and the men who had made it possible. It was a powerful moment. The famous explorer, near the end of his career, passing once more over the most remote point on the planet. But these flights were not without danger. Antarctica was unforgiving. Engines could ice over. Weather could turn deadly in minutes. Navigation over the featureless white landscape was extraordinarily difficult. Every single flight was a gamble against a continent that seemed determined to destroy the men who dared to cross it. While Byrd's aircraft were making history in the skies, another small piece of history was being made far below, in the freezing waters themselves. On New Year's Day, 1947, 2 members of the expedition did something no Americans had ever done before. Using early diving masks and oxygen rebreathing equipment, they descended beneath the surface of the Antarctic Sea. It was the first dive ever made by Americans in Antarctic waters. Imagine that moment. Lowering yourself into water cold enough to kill, beneath a ceiling of ice, into a dark and silent world that no one from your nation had ever entered. It was a small act, performed by just 2 men, far from the headlines. But it was another frontier crossed, another first claimed by Operation Highjump. And this captures something important about the whole expedition. Operation Highjump was pushing into the unknown on every front at once. In the air, mapping the continent from above. On the ice, building a base where none had stood. And now beneath the sea, entering a frozen underwater world for the very first time. For a few short weeks, Task Force 68 was everywhere, above Antarctica, upon it, and beneath its icy waters. The largest expedition in the history of the continent was at the very height of its power. But Antarctica had not finished with them yet, because even as these triumphs were being recorded, the operation was already turning dark. Men were about to die, and the mighty Task Force 68 was about to be pulled out of the ice far sooner than anyone had planned. For all its triumphs, Operation Highjump was about to pay a terrible price. It happened on the 30th of December, 1946, even before the main base had been built. One of the expedition's large flying boats, an aircraft the crew had named George 1, took off to carry out a photographic mission over the Antarctic interior. There were 9 men aboard. The weather that day was treacherous. As George I flew over a remote and frozen region called Thurston Island, the aircraft was caught in a sudden, violent blizzard. Snow and ice blasted against the plane. Visibility collapsed. The crew could no longer see the white world around them. And then, disaster. The aircraft slammed into the ice. George I crashed into the frozen landscape, far from the fleet, far from any help. The impact tore the plane apart, and in that single, violent moment, 3 of the 9 men aboard were killed. Their names were Ensign Maxwell Lopez, Aviation Radioman Wendell Henderson, and Aviation Radioman Frederick Williams. 3 young men, dead on the ice of Antarctica. But the story of George I was not over. Because 6 men had survived the crash. 6 men were now stranded on the ice of Thurston Island. Their aircraft was destroyed. They were hundreds of miles from the base. They were exposed to the full fury of the Antarctic, with limited supplies and little shelter. And they had to wait. What followed was a desperate fight for survival. The 6 survivors clung to life in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The cold tried to take them. The isolation pressed down on them. Every hour was a battle simply to stay alive. The rescue could not come quickly. The same brutal weather that had brought down George I made it almost impossible to reach the crash site. Aircraft and crews struggled against the conditions, trying to locate and recover the stranded men. It took 13 days. 13 days before those 6 survivors were finally found and lifted off the ice to safety. 13 days of cold, fear, and uncertainty. They had lived, but they would never forget what the White Continent had done to them. The crash of George I was the worst tragedy of Operation Highjump, but it was not the only death. On the 21st of January, 1947, the expedition lost another man. His name was Vance Woodall, and he did not die in a dramatic crash or a violent storm. He died during the ordinary, grinding labor of the expedition, in what the records describe as a ship unloading accident on the Ross Ice Shelf. The work of Operation Highjump was relentless and dangerous. Heavy equipment was being used to prepare the ice, to build the runways, to move the mountains of cargo the base required. And in the middle of that punishing work, Vance Woodall was killed by a piece of that heavy equipment. It was a quiet death. There were no headlines for Vance Woodall, but he was just as gone as the men of George I. With his death, the human cost of Operation Highjump was complete. For men had now lost their lives at the bottom of the world. These deaths were not random misfortune. They were the continent itself, showing the expedition exactly what it was up against. Antarctica is the most hostile environment on planet Earth. It is the coldest place in the world. It is the windiest. It is, in many ways, the most dangerous. And Operation Highjump felt that hostility every single day. The weather was a constant enemy. Blizzards could appear with terrifying speed, turning a clear sky into a deadly whiteout in minutes. Temperatures were brutal enough to freeze equipment solid and to kill an exposed man with frightening speed. The pack ice constantly threatened to trap the ships. Fog grounded the aircraft. The continent seemed to resist the expedition at every turn. The men of Task Force 68 had come to Antarctica to test themselves against extreme cold. The continent had answered that challenge, and it had taken 4 of their lives in reply. By February of 1947, it was becoming clear that Antarctica was winning. And this brings us to one of the strangest parts of the entire story. Operation Highjump had been planned as a major, long-term expedition. The mission was expected to last somewhere between 6 and 8 months. An enormous fleet, an enormous effort, built for a long campaign on the ice. But it did not last 6 to 8 months. In late February of 1947, after only a matter of weeks of real operations on the continent, Operation Highjump was suddenly brought to an end. The order came down to withdraw. The ships and the men of Task Force 68 were pulled out of Antarctica and sent home, far ahead of schedule. The largest expedition in the history of the continent was shut down almost as quickly as it had begun. Why? The official explanation was about the weather. The Antarctic summer was ending. Winter, the long, deadly polar winter, was approaching fast. If the fleet stayed too long, the ships could become trapped in the freezing sea, and thousands of men could be stranded in the most hostile place on Earth. Pulling out early, the Navy said, was simply the safe and sensible choice. And that explanation makes a great deal of sense. The approaching winter was a real and serious danger. The deaths, the brutal conditions, the difficulty of the work, all of it pointed toward leaving while leaving was still possible. But the abrupt ending of Operation Highjump, a mission planned for many months, finished in just a few weeks, left behind a lingering question. A question that, decades later, people are still asking. Was the early withdrawal really just about the weather? Or was there something more to the story? So why did Operation Highjump really end so soon? Over the decades, this question has attracted a lot of wild theories. Some stories claim the fleet discovered something hidden in the ice. Some claim there was a secret battle, a hidden enemy, a buried civilization beneath the snow. But when you set the rumors aside and look at the actual historical record, the real answer is far less mysterious and far more human. The first reason was the weather. This was genuine and serious. The Antarctic summer was closing fast, and the long polar winter was coming. If the fleet had lingered, the ships could have been locked in the ice, and thousands of men could have been trapped in the deadliest place on Earth. Leaving early was simply the safe decision. The second reason is less talked about, but just as important. Operation Highjump was, in many ways, poorly organized. It had been put together quickly. Some of the pilots later admitted they were not properly trained for the precision flying the mission demanded. A huge number of the photographs turned out to be nearly useless because there were no ground reference points to make sense of them. The expedition was rushed, and it showed. When Admiral Byrd returned home, he gave an interview that has been quoted and misquoted ever since. Byrd spoke about the security of the United States. He warned his fellow Americans that the world was shrinking fast. He said that the age was over when his country could hide behind its oceans and feel safe simply because of distance. Now, conspiracy theories have twisted these words into something sinister, claiming Byrd was warning about flying saucers or hidden enemies at the poles. But read honestly, in the context of 1947, Byrd's meaning is clear. He was talking about the new reality of the Cold War. He was warning that aircraft, and soon missiles, could cross the poles and reach America. The oceans were no longer a shield. That was his warning, and history proved him right. So was Operation Highjump a failure? No. Despite the deaths, the chaos, and the early ending, the expedition left a real and lasting legacy. The very next year, a smaller follow-up mission called Operation Windmill returned to Antarctica. Its job was to fix Highjump's biggest mistake by going to the surface and gathering the ground reference points that Highjump's 70,000 photographs had lacked. Together, the two operations finally made that aerial photography genuinely useful. Operation Highjump also marked the real beginning of the modern age of Antarctic exploration. The knowledge it gathered helped guide where future research bases would be built. It pulled Antarctica firmly into the awareness of the world. And in time, the continent that nations once eyed for military advantage took a very different path. In 1959, the Antarctic Treaty was signed. That agreement set the entire continent aside for peace and for science, banning military activity across all of Antarctica. The frozen prize that Operation Highjump had sailed toward would never become a battlefield after all. Operation Highjump remains one of the most fascinating expeditions of the 20th century. It was the largest force ever sent to Antarctica. It was driven by Cold War fear, by the hunger for land, and by a navy trying to prove its worth. It cost 4 men their lives. It ended far sooner than anyone planned. And because of that abrupt ending, it left behind just enough mystery for the imagination to run wild. But the true story does not need invented secrets. The real Operation Highjump, a rushed, ambitious, dangerous gamble at the bottom of the world, is remarkable enough on its own. It is the story of an aging explorer on his final great journey, of thousands of men facing the most hostile place on Earth, and of a continent that, in the end, simply refused to be conquered.